Welcome to Women Winning Divorce. I am your host, Heather Quick. I am an attorney, entrepreneur, author, and founder of Florida Women's Law Group, the only divorce firm for women by women. I love thinking big, thinking outside the box, creating creative solutions for women, and empowering women to win in all aspects of their life. Our approach at Florida Women's Law Group is to provide women with a strategy to not only achieve their objectives, but win at life. I believe that what may show up as adversity is simply an opportunity to change and improve your life. In each episode, I sit down with innovative professionals and leaders who are focused on how you can be your best self before, during, and after divorce. In these conversations, we are looking at how women can win at life. I have the unique opportunity to meet women when they are at a transition period of life. But that is only the beginning to becoming your best self and winning at life on your terms. With our guests, we enjoy the opportunity to explore ways all women can win and enhance their life, no matter where they are in their journey. Because divorce is just a point in life, not the end and not what defines you, rather a catalyst for your growth. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. In today's episode, Sarah Charles is going to be joining me. Sarah is the founder and managing principal of Sanctuary Financial Planning in Charlotte, North Carolina. She's a champion of women's financial empowerment and an advocate for increasing women's confidence when it comes to investing. Her firm is focused on teaching women of all ages, stages, and wages to eliminate money shame and develop financial confidence so they can prepare for their financial future with conviction. Sarah has spent over 2 decades at top advisory firms advising clients and advancing innovative approaches to client service before launching Sanctuary Financial Planning with her husband, Jim, in 2023. Sarah can help you divide and protect and build what you have together and protect what's yours in the event of divorce. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Hey, Heather, so glad to be here.
Well, it is great to have you. And it's so important to talk about finances, particularly as it relates to divorce, because so much comes up and there is so much fear and shame that is associated with it. I'm sure you see that all the time.
Absolutely. And I've lived through it in my own divorce.
Well, and I think it's so important that we talk about it to maybe help women going through this, talk about it and rebuild themselves when that's necessary. So I'm so happy to have you on and talk about developing financial confidence during divorce today.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about how you got to where you are, please, Sarah.
Sure. I graduated from Duke with a degree in economics, and then, like almost no economics major, I enrolled in an acting program at NYU because I thought I wanted to be an actress for a hot minute. And that didn't last long. I had a brief stint as an event planner, but eventually landed at Goldman Sachs in 1999. And that started me on my financial services journey. So I've been in finance for almost 25 years. I guess this is my 25th year. And
how long were you with the Goldman Sachs? And how was that experience? How did that help you, build on what you do now?
Yep. I was at Goldman for 5 years. And so I've worn a lot of hats. I was at Goldman for 5 years. That led to a stint at a private equity firm, which led to a stint at a hedge fund before I wound up at a registered investment advisor. I've been on the operations side. I've been on the marketing side. And in 2010, I transitioned into the role of actually working as an advisor, advising clients. So it's a lot of experience, and all of it has shaped how I got to where I am today.
Well, that is great. And tell us a little bit about, what you do now. What is financial planning, and how do you help people, solve their problems and plan for their future?
So I describe financial planning as a framework for navigating all of your financial decision making. And I think if you were to have 100 different advisors in a room and you were to say, what is financial planning to you? They're going to give you 100 different answers. Everybody has a slightly different interpretation, but I like to think of it, like I said, as a framework for navigating all your financial decisions and helping answer what I think is the most common question that people have, which is this idea of, am I going to be okay? Right? Will my money last my lifetime?
And now, how does that, when you're working with, say, female breadwinners, how do those conversations, evolve, and really, what can you bring to the table for those women that can help build that trust?
Well, there's a few things. One, I have been through a divorce, and I'm very candid about what I call my money story, right? My past relationship with money, the mistakes I've made, all the lessons I've learned along the way. And so I'm very candid about my own experiences and share those stories with the women I work with. I also really like to focus on the emotional aspects of financial planning as much as the numerical. So sure, we all want to know, how much do I have today, and is it enough to get me to where I'm going in the future? But let's pause and take a look back. Let's look at what's our past relationship with money, what has influenced us, what are the things we learned when we were younger, and how does that inform where we are today? So we can examine that and make sure it's not keeping you from where you want to be in the future.
I think that's so important. And there is the numbers, but there also exists the emotions around money, that I think that's amazing that you really can help women with that, because they're probably ones who would be more open potentially to talk about the emotions related to it. And especially a woman going through a divorce or just finishing a divorce, there's going to be a lot of both sides of that conversation, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. And statistically, 90 to 95% of women will eventually become their family's primary financial decision maker if they're not already there now. And that's a huge part of my why, Heather. That's a huge part of why I chose to become an advisor, why I do the work I do, because I want to see women step into that role with confidence and conviction. And unfortunately, I've met and worked with a lot of women who aren't prepared. I wasn't prepared. Here I am, an economics major working in financial services, and I had completely abdicated most financial responsibility to my first husband. I sat on the sidelines of my own financial life. And then we separate physically and we start to separate financially. And it's like, whoa, there's this massive wake-up call that I gotta take ownership. I gotta take charge. How did I let myself get so far removed from something that's so important?
I think that's so valuable that you share that, because it happens. And sometimes it just happens just as part of who takes on different roles within the household, but yet the finances are something so important to stay in the loop and to begin to educate yourself. Particularly, you might become the sole financial decision maker, not because of a divorce, but because of a death. And which is, I know, where, the 90 to 95% comes from, because women tend to outlive men. And so you want to do it sooner rather than later and educate yourself. And also, something that I've learned as a business owner, but to become an educated consumer of the financial service, to understand what's out there so that you can, help make decisions, and you're not just letting someone make them for you without your goals and future in mind.
Yes. And I could spend the next hour talking about how broken the financial services industry is and how challenging it is for people to access independent, objective financial advice. They don't know what questions to ask. They don't know what's out there. And so a big part of what I do now is around education.
And I think that's so important. And because that's where you got to start, right? Because you can't have a conversation if that foundation is not there as far as the understanding. And what do you think? Do you think too often, or I don't know, I'd like to know, do you think too often women will, absorb the information, but maybe not ask questions in this particular area for whatever reason?
I do. And I've come up with what I call FUQs, which stands for frequently unasked questions. And it's the questions we're afraid to ask, embarrassed to ask, or don't know to ask. And I do think there's a big lack of knowledge. Like, we don't have that foundational knowledge when it comes to fundamentals of financial literacy. I don't know about you. When I was in school, they taught me how to dissect a frog and what the periodic table of elements was all about, but no one taught me how to build a budget or what compound interest was. So
I know. I think that's a little backwards because, I haven't come across a need to dissect a frog. I got to,
neither have I.
And I've got my basic anatomy. I know what I need to know, right? Nobody's letting me cut on anybody, nor do I want to, but I do think that a balance sheet, some compound interest and things like that, balancing a checkbook should be part of the core. Yeah. And so that's why I think we think, well, one, we don't know what we don't know, right? That's in both our areas. But for whatever reason, right? Like if I was going to be operating on and they're like talking about my appendix and I didn't know about it, I'd be like, well, where is that? I want to know a little bit more. But sometimes we aren't brave enough maybe to ask about the financial because we're like, oh, they think we should know this. Whereas it's never been a part of the core curriculum anywhere.
Yeah. I always talk about spark plugs. I'm never going to change my own spark plugs, but I want to know enough that if the mechanic says, hey, it's time to change your spark plugs, I can ask some thoughtful, informed questions before handing over my credit card and being charged a few $100.
Well, I'm impressed, Sarah, because I don't know much about or anything about spark plugs, but that's okay. We've checked off spark plugs, frog dissection, and financials. So we are going to take a quick break. You guys, our listeners can ponder on these various topics, but we're going to get into more financials and the kind of questions that we should be asking and to help our listeners with that. So listeners, we will be right back after a short break. Thank you. All righty, welcome back, listeners. Today we are joined by Sarah Charles to talk about gaining confidence in finances, particularly as you are preparing for and or going through a divorce. Now, Sarah, before our break, we talked a little bit about your background, but also just some general emotions, feelings that you've seen, when dealing with your clients and talking about financial planning and really like the lack of basic education for most individuals out there in regards to financial planning. But now I want to talk about like, what does that mean for our listeners? And let's talk about maybe some basic key terms, concepts that are important for our listeners, because you know what, if you didn't get it in high school, which we know you really didn't, most likely, but especially if you're in our age group, maybe they're doing a little better now, I'm not sure. But either way, if you're listening, let's talk about some of the main key terms that, you would want our listeners to know.
Yeah. So I think it's super important to understand what you have. So getting organized is really essential. Understanding what accounts do you have, who owns them, where are they located, same thing for credit cards. Do you understand your investments? Do you understand what your money is in? Is it in stocks? Is it in bonds? Is it in mutual funds? Is it in private equity, real estate? I'm actually creating a curriculum right now that I'm calling the Fearless Girl's Guide to Finance. And it creates a pretty basic framework of who, what, where, when, why, how, and breaking down all of these complex financial topics into a framework that's makes sense to people and where we can sort of isolate a particular area. So understanding again what you have, where it's held, how it's invested. And you don't have to know the answers to all the questions, but just start to document it, start to put it down on paper or, you know, in a spreadsheet in a way so you can get your arms around it with professional guidance and help, right? Maybe it's something where you need someone to come in and help you make sense of it all. But the first place to start is just get it organized.
And that's great advice, because very often, and I think particularly, you know, obviously the longer you live and work and you're married, you know, things can add up. Like something as simple as life insurance policies. You know, we find sometimes when we're helping folks through divorce, they have multiple. And it's like, but do you know where they are, what the value? A lot of them are term, but yet if something were to happen, you need to know where these are. And that organization of the financial picture can be, I mean, that's overwhelming for a lot of our clients, because like we have to have full financial disclosure. And it's quite overwhelming for many of our clients.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, just to share part of my story, I never paid attention to tax returns. My ex handled it. He said, sign here. I signed. I never knew if we owed, if we were getting a refund. And then the first year we were separated, I got this massive refund, like enough money that I could afford to actually put central air conditioning in the little home I had been living in. And I just kind of assumed that I would get that same refund every year. So the next year when I owed money, it was like, wait, what? Like that. And so I say all this to say, when we talk about the value of advice, this is one of the things I really mean by it. We don't know what we don't know. And if we need our appendix out, we go to a doctor. We don't try to do it ourselves, you know. And so bringing in trusted professionals to fill in the knowledge gaps and help you navigate what is one of the most stressful and challenging events you're ever going to live through is so critical.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, tell me a little bit about, you know, owning a business and what that means for your financial landscape. Like, how did this change your personal financial strategies?
So I'm a relatively new entrepreneur, Heather, and it's been an interesting experience. So one of the things I was very determined about after my divorce was I was determined to have my own money. This was advice my mother gave me when I was younger. I always say it's the best advice I ever ignored. My mother said, Sarah, keep some money for yourself. A woman should always have her own money. And I said, okay, and then promptly went and put everything I had in a joint checking account. But one of the things I learned, and one of the things I really preach, is this idea of financial independence. Well, walking away from the security and stability of corporate America and starting a business with my spouse means everything is ours. And so it's been a real shift from the financial independence I had carved out over the last decade to financial partnership. And it works, but it's been humbling. It's been humbling to make that transition.
I'm sure. And I think, you know, I think that would be very normal. And, you know, obviously, you know, starting your own business, that is, that's why, you know, and it's worth it when you make it work. It's just can, you know, be difficult at first. And of course, now we have to discuss, since the name of the show is Women Winning Divorce. And, you know, do you have any tips for our listeners or clients that are either seeking or going through divorce? Because you've got so much different experience, your own experience, but then years in financial planning, working with, you know, women on the other side, but you have both sides. So I know you have some great tips and things that would be helpful for our listeners.
I do. And there's two that come right to the top of my mind. The first is trust yourself. trust yourself to get through this process. Going through divorce can be unthinkable. It can be overwhelming. It can be terrifying. And it can be all of those things, even if you're the one who initiated it. Divorce is not always a bad thing. Getting out of a relationship that's not serving you well is not always a bad, that's not a bad thing, but trust yourself to get through it. And then create your community. I think when we say it takes a village, it does take a village, and it can take a village to get you through a divorce. And that community is not just the team of professionals who are guiding you through with their expertise, but that means your family, your friends, your faith community, your work community, whatever that looks like. But allow that support system to hold you at a time when you need it most.
That is great advice, because the team is important. And, just like you were talking about, it's the financial planning, it's the tax, expertise and insight, as well as the legal side. But there's so many things, and rely on the other folks, because it's not something that most people should go through without all of those experts. Now, there are the frequently unasked questions that you had, but are there certain things you do find yourself explaining more often or repeatedly with your clients that you could share for our listeners?
I think a big one is there's a real fear of failure. A lot of women don't take any action because they don't want to make a mistake. And so I like to debunk this myth. And at the end of the day, human beings on the whole are not hardwired to be good at investing. We suffer from a trifecta of behavior, bias, and biology that really keeps us from having a successful investment experience. And so I always like for clients to understand you are not meant to be good at this, and that's okay. It shouldn't keep you from taking action.
That's fascinating. I have never heard that, though. You got to dig in on that a little bit for me.
Okay.
The bias and biology.
Behavior, bias, and biology.
Okay, please go into that a little bit deeper, because that's fascinating to me.
Yeah. So if you think about one of the fundamental rules of investing, it is sell high and buy low. And yet when the stock market is down, when stocks are on sale,
mm-hmm.
most people don't feel really good about buying them. Right? I don't have a ton of clients who call me up when the market's down 20% and say, oh, great, this is an awesome opportunity to put money to work. And that's because we suffer from a lot of cognitive and emotional biases, but there's one in particular that really trips us up in investing, and that's the idea of loss aversion. We feel our losses twice as deeply as we feel any pleasure from our gains. And then when you factor in that financial losses are processed in the same part of the brain as mortal danger, that becomes a pretty simple recipe for turning humans into their own worst enemy when it comes to investing.
Wow. And, I think that's so helpful. Thank you for explaining that, because then we don't feel the shame, like, oh, there's something wrong with us, right? And that's why it's good to have someone else help navigate this for you, to protect you from some of these biological responses that might make you go, I don't care, sell it all, right?
Right. And then you factor in that investing is positioned as some kind of game to be won or lost by the financial media, right? Heather, you too can be a winner at the game of investing if you just pick the right stock or choose the right manager or get in and out of the market at exactly the right time. And so there is a real fear like, oh gosh, this is something that I can mess up. And
right.
That is, that's actually not investing. That's trading, which is more like gambling. And yeah, gambling is a game to be won or lost. But if you take an academic approach to investing and you look at it prudently, it's not something to be won or lost. It's just a process that takes time. And so,
and patience.
Yeah. And so, and that's another concept I spend a lot of time talking about, is the idea of risk, and that not all risk is created equal. There's smart risk, there's not so smart risk. And while our natural risk aversion is what has helped preserve the human species for millennia, it can sometimes interfere with, the decision making that we need to do to live our lives in the modern era.
Now, building on that, because we're talking about the risk, what do you find is the biggest misunderstanding or misconception when it comes to asset management? And how does this differ when we have individuals who have more complex assets?
I think the biggest misconception is that it needs to be complicated. It doesn't. I'm a big believer in letting the market work for you, owning a portfolio of low cost, globally diversified ETFs or mutual funds, set an allocation that makes sense for what you're trying to accomplish, and put a plan in place to guide you. And that's really all you need. It's kind of like the little black dress of investing, right? It's simple, it's elegant, it's timeless. And so I don't think there needs to be a lot of complexity, and there doesn't need to be a lot of action taking in order to see results over time.
And I think that is important what you said, though, and that's why your financial planner is so important, because to achieve what you want to achieve, like, it has to start with where you are and what your outcomes are, right? And where you want to be.
Yes. And one of the first things that I ask all clients to do is to draft a statement of financial purpose. I want you to have a why, because that is something you can anchor to when times get tough or markets get scary. And it might change because life changes, and that's okay. But I always want people to have a why behind their decision making, because then the decisions they make reflect what is truly most important to them, and it's not reflecting some external source.
I like that. I think that's really important. Now, when advising a client who's going through divorce, are there specific strategies that you would recommend that may pertain more to them than, let's say, a non-divorcing client?
Well, I am a big believer in premarital agreements, although when someone's going through a divorce, it's a little late for that advice.
Yes.
I do think it's important not to make any big financial decisions in the first 6 to 12 months. Do any short-term blocking and tackling that you have to do to separate financially, get accounts set up, relist your beneficiaries, but don't make any big decisions, because again, going through a divorce is so emotional and so traumatic for so many people. Just give yourself time to get through that before you start really imagining what you want your financial future to look like.
I think that's important, because very often going through a divorce, depends, right? We have, human beings, so they go through so many feelings, but sometimes it's like, well, I need to do this now. I need to go buy a place, and I need to have XYZ. And I tend to caution them, because well, we always owned a house and now we're selling it and I shouldn't rent. And I understand that, but it's like, well, maybe give yourself a little grace and some time to figure out who you are, who you want to be. And that, once you get a little bit away from the end of the divorce, can provide you with some clarity. And sometimes you might feel really differently about where you want to be in the future. Like for house, that is a good example.
It's a great example. And I love the idea of just silencing the shoulds for a little while. there's so much growth and change and self-exploration that happens after divorce. At least there was for me. And you don't have clarity when you're in that messy middle and you're going through it. And you need to allow yourself to come out on the other side and get through some healing before you go ahead and start writing the next chapter.
Yeah. And I think that especially when it relates to finances, because, so you may make rash decisions that then you will regret, or, you could lose money, things like that. So I think that is, additionally, they're all kind of big decisions that we usually ask our client, or counsel them. Just give yourself 12 months to, settle in on the new you and the new circumstances of your life. But, where do you find your clients having the biggest hurdles or obstacles?
I think there's a lot of fear, which is totally human and totally normal. And I guess I've also seen people who try to replicate what they had. They want to maintain something that looks and feels similar to the life that they're leaving. And if that's what you want to do, I can't tell you not to, but I don't think you're giving yourself the opportunity to explore the new, what's next.
Mm-hmm. Well, and obviously that makes sense because the fear, right? And the fear of the unknown, and what is that going to look like versus what was comfortable. But, then I think that they do get stuck, and then it's hard to really grow.
Oh yeah. Inertia is real. And I see it with clients going through divorce and clients not going through divorce. People like to stay where they are.
Absolutely. It's true. It's true. And sometimes unless it's the forces beyond your control, sometimes are what people need to cause them to take some movement. Now, do you, as the financial counsel and in your role, find yourself talking to a lot of clients about prenuptial agreements or ways to protect assets, especially if you're the breadwinner?
I do. When it comes up, I absolutely talk about it. And again, I always share my own experience and my own story. So when my first husband and I got engaged, my dad gave me a book called Prenups Are for Lovers, which was written by an attorney out of New York. And I took it and I said, thanks. And then I stuck it in my sock drawer and never looked at it again. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, like I have no assets. I'm 20 something years old. And, and of course I was idealistic and we're going to live forever and ever. And when Jim and I met and we started dating, it was very early on. And he said, if I ever get married, I want a prenup. And I was like, absolutely. Because I had learned how important it is to protect what is yours. And I don't think that getting a prenuptial agreement is somehow means you assume your marriage is going to end. I don't buy homeowners insurance because I assume my house is going to burn down. I buy homeowners insurance to protect myself against a wide range of outcomes that might not be favorable to me. And so particularly, I feel like it comes up a lot with people who are either marrying later in life, or maybe it's a second marriage, but they're coming into it much more established.
Yes.
I just think it's so important. And I wish it didn't have the stigma of being, again, like, hey, you're getting a prenup? Well, that means you're going to get divorced. I think just the opposite. I think when you can communicate openly and honestly about money with someone, that is a sign of a really deep connection and real trust and real love.
I agree. And I've had this conversation before on the podcast with probably a financial planner and talking about that, because as you related to it, everybody has a money story and we all have beliefs, feelings about money that come really, I think, from, our family of origin. And the opportunity doesn't present itself when you get married. It should, but there to talk about these things. So the very fact that you engage in a conversation, I agree with you, it begins to build a much better foundation for moving forward, because being married in and of itself, there is a combination of assets, whether you keep your own, but like houses, and as life goes on, things, come together.
Yeah. And the older we get, the more complicated life becomes. I think there's so much value in building and developing financial intimacy between partners. And again, that's that honest conversation about all the things you would talk about when you're working through your prenuptial agreement.
Absolutely. Well, that was a great topic, and I'm glad we delved into that. And so I'm excited to go deeper in the next segment. But first, we are going to take a quick break so our listeners can visit their favorite social site to follow at For Women Law. We have more to come with Sarah Charles. We'll be right back. Welcome back from our break, listeners. We are almost out of time with Sarah Charles and our conversation surrounding financial confidence in divorce. And Sarah and I talked about like the basics of asset management and some things that really hold people back, and the real issues like fear and even biology that create resistance at times to stay invested. But we have more to still cover. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you, but we ran out of time before the last break, are there any trends you're seeing for high net worth or complex asset clients?
I think, Heather, that there are always investment trends and investment fads. Right now, there's a lot of focus on cryptocurrency, and especially Bitcoin with the new ETFs that were just approved. There's a lot of buzz around the Mag 7, which are the 7 big technology stocks that are driving a lot of market performance. There's even talk around AI and what's the impact on investments. And I will go back to my earlier comment, which is we take a little black dress approach to investing and, approach it in a way that is simple, timeless, and elegant. However, I always like to offer up a basic framework to help people make their decisions and evaluate, well, is this the right thing for me to do? And it's 4 questions. So ask yourself, 1, do I already own this, right? In the example of Bitcoin, I don't own any Bitcoin, so maybe I do want to buy a Bitcoin spot ETF. Actually, I don't, but if I think about some of these tech stocks, right? It's like, oh, everyone's talking about Apple and Microsoft and Nvidia. Well, I own an S&P 500 fund, and all those stocks are already in that fund. So ask yourself, do I already own this? Why should I expect a return? And in the case of stocks, we generally expect a return because we assume the company is going to innovate and grow and increase its return to shareholders. What are the costs for buying and holding this investment? And most importantly, how does it align with my goals and the things that I'm trying to accomplish with my resources? And I think using that as a framework, it can help people sift through some of the shiny trends that are out there and stay focused on what's tried and true and what aligns with their why.
I think that's really important. And I think that's why I had the relationship you have with your financial planner, so that you can talk through these things with them. And, if they're the type of person, it's like, I gotta experiment, try something. It's like, okay, well, then, do the cryptocurrency, but not in a way that's going to affect your whole portfolio and potentially have negative consequences. It's just probably much riskier. But so, let's keep that, like you said, within your goals. Now, what does your relationship with a client's attorney typically look like? Are there certain types of information you might provide to a divorce attorney when, you're working with a client, and of course, everybody's in agreement because, they want to share resources to help our clients?
I love to see it be a collaborative team effort. And I think one of the most important roles that an advisor can play during the divorce is by helping with scenario analysis to determine if a proposed settlement will make financial sense. Ultimately, everyone on the team has their area of expertise, and I think teams function best when people are working together.
Now, what are some situations that might get alarming and really in need of financial expertise during the divorce process?
Well, certainly, when you say alarming, I immediately think of financial abuse or financial infidelity, where someone's hiding assets and then you need to bring in a forensic accountant to start digging through the paperwork. But then there's also working with people who are just really in the dark and unaware and feeling overwhelmed by stepping into the role of financial decision maker for the first time. And then there's some of the basic tactical, practical, how do you divide up assets? I don't know what the laws are in Florida, but in North Carolina, we're an equitable distribution state. And so settlements have to be equitable.
Yes, and that's the same in Florida. So it is similar.
And understanding, there's two ways to think about it. It's what's the numeric value, right? But also not all assets are created equally. And if you want to keep the house and forego money in an investment account, well, what does that look like in terms of dollars, but also liquidity, taxes, long-term appreciation? So it helps to have people, again, guide you through that process so that you're not making decisions that are purely based on, what your heart is telling you, but you can make them with additional perspective.
I like that. Now, what are 2 or 3 things you find yourself saying to all of your clients who are going through a divorce?
1, you will get through it. It does not always feel like it, but you will get through it. 2, there's a price on your mental well-being. And I hate to see people get so focused on a financial outcome that they are willing to sacrifice their own emotional well-being. And I'm a big fan of collaborative divorce. And even if people aren't doing collaborative, how civil and amicable can you make it?
Whenever possible. I'm not sure if, and this was interesting as I've interviewed more attorneys throughout the country, I just assumed mediation was required. It's required in Florida for all divorces, but not every state requires it. So even if it's not a fully collaborative in the definition, we have a collaborative process through mediation, right, which can make the majority of the cases settle, and it can make for such a better, amicable, and really can help complete your divorce, give you that closure in a process that you got to participate in versus a judge making all of those decisions for you. And that can be hard because, it's just to not have the control over your finances and your family in making those decisions.
For the people who I know and work with where their divorce is in litigation, it's such a drain, not just financially, but emotionally, and it takes much focus and so much energy. And I remember, again, going through my own divorce and going through the process of, figuring out a settlement agreement. And at the end of the day, I decided that I wanted to put it behind me. And so I was willing to negotiate. And that leads to my third point, which is I'm pretty sure that every single person who has ever gone through a divorce probably feels like they've left something on the table. I suspect that most people say, oh, my ex got the better end of the bargain. I gave something up. I know I did. And I'm sure if you ask my ex, he'd probably say he did. So, just know that
I think that's a normal, I'm glad you normalized that feeling, in that both sides probably feel like that.
Right. But it comes back to what's the greatest priority. And for me, I always believe the greatest priority has got to be emotional well-being.
Absolutely. And closure and, independence. And that's why, just as when I say women winning divorce, because you won, because you got your independence and you got closure and it was done. And sometimes, okay, so you didn't have this, but yet you've really won because you're moved on with your life and you didn't get stuck in that, just that cycle. And it can go on for quite some time.
It can.
And you don't realize it, you're in it and then so far gone. You're like, why? How did I get so far gone and stuck on what are probably, in the whole grand scheme of things, and not always, but very often, a minor or a smaller issue, and maybe just one thing, and yet so much importance gets attached to it that it can make it very difficult for some people just to see the bigger picture and get themselves closure.
Yep. Agree 100% with that, Heather.
Now, how is working with men and women different? And have you altered your approach, if at all, when you work with women?
I think probably the biggest difference is more of my female clients lack confidence. And so there's a big component of education and helping them develop that confidence, whether it's, teaching them the fundamentals of, hey, what's the difference between a stock and a bond, or helping them rethink risk. I do tell anyone who I work with that, as I shared, human beings aren't hardwired to be good at this. So give yourself some grace. And I do like to tell my female clients that they actually have investing superpowers. So humans aren't really good at investing, but some of the things that women think hold them back, like taking time to do research and ask questions, or staying invested once they make a decision, that actually serves them well. And there's a number of studies that document women's outperformance over men when it comes to investing. And I feel like that little nugget of information really gives people a nice little boost.
That is, I like that. I like that. Well, as we are nearing the end of our show, because it's been great talking with you, you would share with our listeners and me, what you've learned from working with women and families throughout your career that you could share.
I have witnessed the benefit of what it means to have access to independent, objective financial advice. And I see the impact it has on confidence and clarity and decision-making. And I love nothing more than to see a female client who I met when she was at the beginning of her divorce process, and then to talk to her a year or 2 or 3 years later and see how much she has grown and how much she has benefited from having us be there to support her on this journey.
Well, that is awesome. And we really appreciate that. And for all our listeners, we are going to have all of Sarah's information listed in our show notes. And lastly, though, before we leave, the name of your company and website, Sarah, if you could share that for our listeners once again.
Sure. We are Sanctuary Financial Planning, and the website is www.sanctuaryfinancialplanning.com.
Thank you so much for being here today, Sarah. This information has been very valuable.
Thanks for having me, Heather. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Well, we have reached the end of our show today, and we really appreciate having Sarah join us to discuss all things financially related within a divorce. Well, not all things, but we covered a lot. We did. And listeners, if you or someone you know is going through a divorce or is thinking about a divorce, please reach out to us at FloridaWomen'sLawGroup.com or join our Facebook group, Women Winning Divorce. Links will be in the episode description. And please, if you like the show and know someone who may like it, we ask that you share it and give us a 5-star review so others can find our show. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Women Winning Divorce. My goal is to elevate your life and the way you are thinking so that you are best equipped to win at life. If you enjoy the show, Please subscribe so you automatically get my new shows every week. And I would love to hear from you personally. Come join the conversation on social and join our Facebook group, Women Winning Divorce. We welcome your comments and suggestions. We want to bring you content that helps move your life forward. Women Winning Divorce is the place for an elevated conversation on how women can thrive during times of adversity in order to live their best life.